Unit 4, Symbolizing English Sentences. In this section, we're going to look at how we can take English sentences and convert those into symbolic form. So if you think about the truth tables that we were working with last time and the truth connectives that we've already learned, in order to apply those truth tables, it's going to be much easier to do that if we have things in a sort of compressed symbolic form. So what we're going to do here is sort of go over the basics of translating from English into symbolic form, so that eventually what we can do is take those translations and determine whether or not we have good or bad arguments. So ultimately we're going to start with statements, with individual statements, and just learn how to translate those statements. But as we go on, the idea is that you will be able to take a long string of statements, premises, that supposedly lead to a particular conclusion, put those into symbolic form, and then by applying your truth tables, determine whether or not the argument that you've been presented with is a valid deductive argument. And you're going to do that with the truth tables. So here we're just going to begin with some basic symbolizations, what letters or what words translate into the various connectives, because there are multiple words in English that can represent each of the connectives. So the first thing that we do when we do a translation is to determine the simple sentences. One helpful thing to do is that when you take a sentence initially, you can use parentheses or underline the simple sentences. So as you're analyzing a statement and attempting to put it into symbolic form, one thing I like to do is either put parentheses around each of the simple sentences or underline the simple sentences. And then it's often helpful to identify what you believe to be are the connectives. So let me give you an example of this. So let's take the following. Joe likes strawberries, but Maggie is allergic to them. Now in this case, I don't really have to rewrite the sentence, but I can identify the simple statements. It seems here that I have a compound statement, and it's pretty easy to see the compound statement. So I have right here, Joe likes strawberries, but Maggie is allergic to them. So I could say Maggie is allergic to them. Them, of course, refers to the strawberries. So I've got a simple sentence here. I've got my second simple sentence here. And the but seems to be the connection between the two, right? Which, as we'll see, signifies a conjunction. So if I were doing this, I would say something like, I might write down J, and I might say Joe likes strawberries. So I have this, and then I might say M, and in this case, the only thing I might do is reword this slightly as saying Maggie is allergic to strawberries. So this would be one way in which I would rewrite the statement, because the them in this case is acting as a replacement for strawberries. So this is what we mean. So the first step would be I look at the statement, identify each of the simple statements, the simple sentences. Joe likes strawberries. Maggie is allergic to strawberries. I circle the connectives I underline. So now I have a general idea of the basic structure of the statement that I'm looking at. Now, as I've already sort of shown you, is that once I've determined the simple sentences, I will assign to each of the sentence a capital letter. Now these are, and I want to really emphasize here, these are not variables. So when I say Joe likes strawberries and Maggie is allergic to strawberries, the J and the M are just a shorthand way of representing that very specific sentence. So they are not variables as I used before. So when we use the lowercase letters, as I've mentioned previously, lowercase p, q, r, s, t, and so forth, those will be viewed as variables, and those can be you can substitute any simple sentence or any complex sentence in for that variable. So when I do assign a letter, the sort of format that we use here, and I did it just a second ago, right? Capital letter with the triple bar, and then write out the simple sentence. Now, it won't always be necessary for you to write these out when you're doing assignments. Oftentimes in your book, on exams, the the statements will be given for you. So it will say J equals, or J triple bar, I should say, Joe likes strawberries. And M with the triple bar, Maggie is allergic to them. So many times in your book, you'll see that those letters have already been assigned. If you're given a statement to translate and there is no letter given to you, then you should follow that format where you give some letter, some capital letter with the triple bar, and then you would write out the simple statement. Now, again, you always want to write the simple statement separately. You would never want to combine these in anywhere, have any connectives in there, with the exception of the negation. So when you write out a simple statement, you can write out the simple statement with negations if they're in there. Now, when I come across a non-truth functional operator in my statements, they're treated just as if they are singular sentences. So in the example I gave before, it was pretty easy to see the two simple sentences. When you have a non-truth functional compound sentence, you treat that as a singular. So for example we have here, Joe went to class because there was going to be a movie. Because in this instance is not a truth functional operator. It's not Joe went to class and there was going to be a movie, right? That's not what it was actually saying. It wasn't saying Joe went to class and there was going to be a movie. It's saying that Joe went to class. The because is actually giving an explanation for Joe's actions. It's not a conjunction in that way. So it's not acting as a truth functional operator. And so in this instance, if I were to symbolize this, as you can see here, J with the triple bar, Joe went to class because there was going to be a movie. It would just be the entire statement. Now that looks like a complex statement or a compound statement, but it's not. Again, because the because is not a truth functional operator. So sometimes you will run across these long sentences. The length of the sentence does not in any way tell you that it is necessarily a compound or complex statement. So you need to be careful when you have non-truth functional operators when you're doing translations. Now, in symbolizing sentential operators, the same logical force, as I say here, may be expressed by a number of different words for each of the connectives. So I've already sort of pointed out one. And when we have a conjunction, for example, so the conjunction actually has several different words that can represent a conjunction, which we normally think of as and as a conjunction, but it turns out but is also the same thing, logically speaking. So if you use and or but, either of those are actually interchangeable when we're talking, when we're speaking about logical force of the connectives. They're represented, both of these would be represented by the dot. All right, so there are certain words you should know, and we're just going to go over a few of them. There's more in your book. This also, at this point, it's a good idea to start keeping a list of these words with you while you're working on translation. So it's often helpful to have the list of different words that can represent each of the different connectives with you so that you don't have to keep looking back in your book to find them. It also helps in the memorization if you sort of make up a sheet that you can keep next to you. So for the conjunction, conjunctions are represented when you have an and statement, right? The conjunction, remember, is the and, the dot. However, nevertheless, still, but still, although, even, though, also, and also, not only, but also, while, despite, the fact, moreover. Now, it should be noted that some of these are can sometimes be a connective and sometimes aren't. So, as you note here, while and still may or may not be acting as a sentential operator. And so I want to look at those briefly just to show how they might not be working as connectives. But when you see these words, most of the time, the other ones, right, aside from while and still, will represent the conjunction, right? That indicates to you, I should replace that word, in other words, the word that I would circle, for example, with the dot. So still, now why still may not be acting as a conjunction? Because it may be an adverb. So it is still dark outside. Notice that if you tried to break this down as a compound statement, it wouldn't make any sense, right? It is still, and it's dark outside. It is, and still dark outside. Not sure what that would be. So this clearly is one simple sentence. It's an adverb. Still, in this case, is acting adverb, not as a conjunction. On the other hand, while may indicate two activities are not only taking place, but are doing so simultaneously, as in John waited in the car while Mary went into the store. In some cases, it's often difficult to figure out which way it's being used. So John waited in the car and Mary went into the store. John waited in the car while Mary went into the store seems to imply that they were doing the same thing, the same two things simultaneously. So again, sometimes you have to figure out from the context of the statement what's going on. But this is one where it seems that John and Mary were together. Mary's doing something while John is doing something else simultaneously, right? So John's waiting in the car isn't a separate activity. John is doing this and Mary. What the sentence is trying to say is, oh, what were they doing simultaneously? While she was in the store, he was doing this. So again, it's understandable if you look at that and say, how would I know? Sometimes it's going to come from the context of the statement. So there'll be other statements surrounding it that would indicate what the meaning is. Other times you can get it from the argument itself. You'll look and say, oh, here's clearly what was implied by that. Other times it's just very difficult to figure out. So with experience and practice, you can start to see when statements are being used one way or another. This also tells us another thing about logic, or the value of logic, is that in English, we are often sloppy with the things that we're saying, right? So what is it I'm trying to express here? Am I trying to express a conjunction of two activities? John was home working and Mary was at the store? Or John was home working while Mary was at the store? So is while in these cases being used in a situation to show two simultaneous actions? Oh, they were doing these at the same time or as a conjunction. Again, it can often be difficult, but it also shows us that perhaps in those cases we want to be very clear when we're expressing ourselves to be sure that we're expressing ourselves in ways that are logically understandable. So this is one of the things that this sort of analysis does. It actually makes us more aware of how we're using words and what kind of truth value these words we're trying to have, or these compound statements we're attempting to convey to others. Now the disjunction is pretty slim in terms of which words. It's or, either or else, right? So these are really the only three that you're going to see for disjunction. There's an exception here. Unless, which we'll talk about in a minute, can also be added to this list. It can be translated as an or statement, right? So the disjunction, again, remember we're talking about the V or the wedge, and the unless can also indicate an or statement. The reason it's not included here is that unless is also a horseshoe statement, can also indicate a special form of the horseshoe statement, which we'll talk about. So the or may be expressed as inclusive or exclusive. And I've mentioned this previously. For the purposes of our truth table, the or statement is inclusive, right? And that just simply means that if both sides of the disjunct, if these, for example, are both true, then in our truth table we allowed that the or statement is true. In other cases, we might want to say, no, it's not an inclusive or. In other words, it's not this or both. We want to say not both. We want to say, no, it's one or the other. When you want to express that, then this is the symbolic form that you would use, P or Q, and not the quantity P and Q. So it says, I'm going to do P or I'm going to do Q, but it's not the case that I'm going to do both P and Q. That's what that statement actually says. All right, so P or Q, but not both P and Q. So this is how you would make the exclusive version of an or when you're doing a translation. Now, again, in many cases, it doesn't matter whether you do the exclusive or inclusive. Most times when you're supposed to translate it exclusively, the English statement will be sort of specific. So the examples you get in the book. So say Joe's going to go to the ball game, or he's going to go out to eat, but he's not going to do both. All right, so in most cases, they're going to be very explicit about that. But again, note in our everyday conversation, we tend to use or in a more exclusive sense, but we don't express it that way, right? I don't say to you, well, I'm going to my office or I'm going to get lunch, but I am not going to both go to my office and get some lunch. Right? We normally don't speak that way because it's sort of understood in most cases, or at least in most contexts, that when I tell you I'm doing one or the other, I'm not implying that I'm doing both. Logically, though, in order to make that clear, if I don't say if I'm going to my office or I'm going to get lunch, if I'm being a good logician, all I told you was that I'm doing one or the other, or it's possible that I'm doing both, unless I add that second part. So unless I add the not the quantity P and Q, then I've left myself, or I've at least expressed something inclusively. Now negation, in many instances, negation is going to be tied with some other connective. So nor or not or so forth. I should say nor, not, obviously one of them. The difficulty with negation is determining what part of the sentence the negation applies to. So when I say something like not both, it's clearly the negation of a conjunction. Not both P and Q is symbolized as not P and Q. It may also be symbolized as not P or not Q. So it turns out there's two different ways that you can actually symbolize the not both, one in terms of conjunctions, one in terms of disjunctions. But not both, just remember, is not P and Q, not the quantity P and Q, or not P or not Q. Not P or not Q. Now, neither P nor Q is the negation of the or. So neither nor tells me that this is an or statement with a negation, right? And so we get the not P or Q. It may also be symbolized as not P and not Q. So to see more clearly how this is, you can look in Unit 4, Section 3 in your textbook. There's several good examples of why these are translated the way they are. I think it's pretty clear neither nor is the or statement, and not both is clear from this. But oftentimes people get a little bit confused about the alternate form. Later on, we'll be able to show you exactly why these two statements, for example, are logically equivalent to each other. So we'll show you in symbolic form based on the truth tables. For now, I would just simply commit to memory that when I say neither nor, it's either the negated or statement, or it's not P and not Q. Material conditional. Now the material conditional, just to refresh our memory here, is the horseshoe statement, with the left side being the antecedent and this being the consequent on the right. So material conditional, when you see an if, unless, as I noted, provided, only if, given that, supposing that, in the event that. So these words are the ones that are normally going to signify that what follows is the antecedent in the conditional statement. Now, you'll notice there's several there that have the asterisk. That's because these aren't completely, aren't necessarily completely true. There's some little quirks we're going to have. So let me talk about these sort of special cases that we have here. So what follows the if is going to be the antecedent. The only if is a special case, and the unless, as I mentioned already, can be translated as an or has its own special sort of flipping that we have to do when actually doing the translation. So the only if is the first special case, the difference between if and only if. So if I say Q if P, so as I mentioned before, those words that we presented, what follows those words are normally the antecedent. So P would be on the left side and Q would be on the right, as you can see here. So Q if P is symbolized if P then Q. All right, and so that's pretty straightforward. Now the exception is when we have the only if. So when you have only if, then the order isn't changed. So Q only if P in this instance means it's Q therefore P. The other way you can also symbolize this is not P, therefore not Q. And actually this form will learn how to change the Q therefore P to not P, therefore not Q. This is actually one of the replacement rules we'll get later on when we get to natural deduction. But for purposes here, what you really want to remember is what follows the if is always the antecedent, unless there is an only in front of it. If it's only if, then you do not change the order. So Q if P becomes if P then Q. Q only if P. You do not flip the order, and it's Q horseshoe P. Q therefore P. Now the unless is another sort of special case. And as I mentioned, it can be translated as an or. But when you translate unless, P unless Q is rephrased as P if not Q. And therefore, P if not Q would be not Q, therefore P. So you can see that P unless Q, if you take this and remember that unless becomes if not, P if not Q, well, what follows the if is the antecedent. The negation there is thrown in. So we've got now not Q, therefore P. It can always be symbolized as an or statement. So if the if not P if not Q confuses you, or you forget exactly what the order is, you can always fall back on the P or Q. And for example of a special case, if you want more examples of these to go over, you can see that in Unit 4, Section 3D in your textbook. But again, this is the special case unless P if not Q, so not Q, therefore P, or you can simply just throw an or statement as we said before. So either one is perfectly acceptable when doing translations. In some cases, the unless, it's just a lot easier to throw the unless symbol in, especially when you're dealing with a very long compound sentence or complex sentence. It means that you don't have to flip the sentence around structurally when you're doing the translation. Other times, either of the two translations, ways of translating unless are equally good in terms of the translation. Again, remember, in all of these, logically, we don't care, because logically, the value is the same. As long as you translate it correctly, whether you use an or statement or a negated horseshoe statement, both of them come up mean the same thing as far as a logician is concerned. Now, the biconditional doesn't have a whole lot of sort of keywords. If and only if is the one that is most common that you'll see. If and only if, just in case, just in the event that. All right, so those are terms that are used to represent the biconditional. P, if and only if Q, is simply symbolized with, as I said here, the biconditional, right? We know our biconditional. Now, the biconditional can also be symbolized as a conjunction of two horseshoe statements. So P, if and only if Q, so if here P triple bar Q, can also be rewritten as P therefore Q and Q therefore P. This really doesn't come into play until we get into natural deduction in our rules. So it's a good thing just to sort of commit this to memory. It'll be helpful later on. But the biconditional, so the biconditional being translated into the conjunction of two conditional statements will come into play later in the course. But again, the words you should be looking at, if and only if, that's going to be the most common, just in case, and just in the event that. This is how we'll do the translations for biconditionals. All right, so let's do a few example exercises to help you with these sort of translations. The first one, man is descended either from small primates or great apes. So the first thing I want to do is look and determine what the simple sentences are and find my connectives. So man is descended either from small primates or from great apes. In this case, I would look and say, well, it seems probably going to be the case that man is descended from small primates. All right, so that's one simple sentence. Man is descended either from small primates or great apes. Second sentence, man is descended from great apes. All right, so let's say capital P with my triple bar, I'm going to say is for man is descended from small primates. G, man is descended from great apes. Either or, right, tells me that I have an or statement between my simple statements, right? So in this case, it's the subject is the same. It's the predicate expression that is compound. So I have P or G, right? So from here, I can sort of just write out exactly what I have. Man is descended from small primates, or man is descended from great apes. Now, this is one where the context, you might say, well, wait a minute, is it possible we're descended from both? So notice with an inclusive or, this implies that P or G, it could possibly be that man is descended from primates and man is descended from great apes. Now, if you believe what the statement is saying is, no, it's only one or the other, then you would say, well, man is descended from primates or man is descended from great apes, and it's not the case that man is descended from primates and great apes. Now, given that I'm not a evolutionary biologist, I don't know if it's possible for us to have been descended from both. Is it possible that two lines of human beings, both coming from primates and great apes, eventually merged into us? I suppose that's possible. Again, you'd have to go over to the biology department and find out whether that's true, or anthropology. They might be able to help you out with this. So either of these would be okay, right? So I would accept either of these, given that I don't know. But notice there's a definite ambiguity in the statement. It seems to imply it's one or the other and not both. So if you translated it in the simple form, P or G, it's fine. It may be more accurate to say P or G and not both P and G. And by the way, this would make a difference, logically speaking, in an argument, right? Whether it's one P or G, the first one. So let's take our first translation, and two, our more complex translation. But I would accept either of those two, of the ones you've given here. Okay, so another one, high-speed trains are developed. If high speeds are developed, then automobile use will decrease. So if high-speed trains are developed, then it seems pretty clear that I have an if-then statement going on here. Let's say H. And again, you can pick any letters you want to do your simple sentences, but I'm going to say high-speed trains are developed and automobile use will decrease are my two simple sentences. That's what it appears to me. So I'll say high-speed trains are developed and then let's use A for automobile use will decrease. So as I said, it doesn't matter what letters you use as long as you stay consistent. So high-speed trains will be developed, then automobile use will decrease. Since it's a if-then, I can see I've got a horseshoe statement, so it's very simple enough to translate. H, therefore A. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute. Yeah, if high-speed trains are developed, then automobile use will decrease. But isn't decrease indication of a negation, right? Doesn't that indicate a negation? In fact, it doesn't. So you want to be careful when you see things like decrease or lowers, because actually decrease is not the opposite of increase. Well, it might be the opposite of increase, but there's three possibilities, right? Something can increase, it can decrease, and it can stay the same. So it's not the negation of the other, is what I should say. Decreasing is not the negation of increasing, because it's possible that there's a third option where it remains the same. So it's not actually a negation. So when you do a translation like this, unless you see that not, unless you see something that's clearly a not, decrease or lowers is not a negation indicator, right? Because of those three possibilities, right? Just because it's not increase, negating increase doesn't get you decrease, right? They're not opposites in that way, logically speaking. So at the end, you would translate this as H, therefore. And notice what follows the if is the antecedent, and the rest is the consequent, right? Another example, John drives his van only if he is camping or needs to haul large loads. So I might say, John drives his van. There's a simple statement. He is camping, assuming John is camping, or needs to haul large loads. Now I've got an only if, and I've got an or statement. So the only if tells me that I've got a horseshoe statement somewhere, and the or statement obviously tells me that I have an or. Now I might say, what are the simple sentences? Well, let's say I'm going to assign V, John drives his van, C for John is camping, and H for needs to haul large loads. So if I were doing this formally, I'd say V is John drives his van, and I would say C, John is camping, and H, John needs to haul large loads. So this would be, again, if you were picking out the letters and deciding what each of those simple sentences represented, you'd have to spell those out so that I or your reader would know what the shorthand that you're using, what each of those letters represents. In this case, what follows the only if, so notice that what follows the if is normally in the antecedent, but we have an only if here, which means that the order of our translation doesn't change. So in this case, I would say if John drives his van, only if, in this case is the horseshoe statement, he is camping or he needs to haul large loads. So if John drives his van, then he is either camping or he needs to haul large loads. So again, if you're wondering the only if, remember the only if doesn't change the order, right? What follows the if is always in the antecedent unless there is an only in front of it. So in this case, we don't change the order. So the correct translations for this would be if V, therefore C or H. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he is working late. Okay, so this is a nice long statement here. John will make supper. All right, so you have John will make supper and John will wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he is working late. So I've done there sort of identify the simple statements, right? So S, I'm going to say for John will make supper. Again, remember, pick whatever letters you want, will make sense to you. John will wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he is working late. So notice, now I have all my simple sentences. Now what are the connectives? I have an and statement, I have an unless, I have an or statement. Here you get to make sort of a choice all your own. So first, let me go ahead and do the sort of formal. S is John will make supper. And again, this is necessary when the letters aren't defined. You're going to have to say what it is. In many cases, if there's assignments, in fact, if you're given, for example, a paper where there is where it's easy for you to simply put parentheses and letters above, that's fine. When that's not the case, you do have to sort of write out the simple sentences so that it's clear which letters represent which statements, and that way I'll be able to determine whether or not you've done the proper translation. So wash the dishes, well, it's actually John will wash the dishes. All right, so that's the second. H, simply, it is a holiday. And the last one, L, he is working late. And obviously in this case, the he is referring to John. So John is working late. So there's our simple sentences. John will make supper and wash the dishes. So John will make supper and John will wash the dishes. Unless, now if I do the unless as an or statement, I just got my dot here, got my or here, I got another here. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless, in this case I'm using the or, it is a holiday or he is working late. So there's one way in which I could represent this particular statement. Now, if you wanted to use the other version of unless, then you would say it's not the case. If it's not the case that it's a holiday or John is working late, then what does he do? He makes supper and he washes the dishes. So there's version 1 and version 2. Both of them, because these are logically equivalent, right? Both of these statements, it doesn't matter which one you actually use when you do your translation. So there you go. You've got a nice, easy breakdown. Again, once you sort of identify those simple sentences, figure out what the connectives are, and in many cases here, again, it sort of becomes intuitive where the main break is. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless, so the John will make supper and wash the dishes. These seem to be, based on the context of the statement and what's being expressed here, this is the first part. So the main connective here is the or statement or the horseshoe, depending on which way you do it. That's the first part, main connective. The second part, H or L, this also seems to be the second part, right? Sometimes one of the hints that you will often find is that when you have a compound statement or a more complex statement like this, when you see a comma, the comma often indicates that everything to the left of the comma is to be grouped together and the things to the right of the comma are to be grouped together. From this statement, we just have to use the context to understand what the context of the statement is. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless it is a holiday or he's working late. So it seems those first two conditions are together. John will make supper and wash the dishes unless, he'll do that unless these other two things, it's one of these other two things obtains, right? So that's how we sort of judge it. Now, again, as you do more examples in the book, as you work over more exercises, you'll start to see sort of where the connectives are, which one's the main connective. You'll see the various variations. I would encourage you to do the starred problems in your book. One good way to learn this is to do the translation first, look in the back of the book, check your answer, go back, try it again. If you've gotten it wrong, write out again, see where you made your mistake, go back and check it, right? Or do a couple of more problems and then go back to make sure. But the more problems you work, the more comfortable you'll get doing these translations.